I've been married to Ashley for about 8 years now. She's the kind of woman who lights up a room, smart, funny, beautiful. She's got it all. We met through mutual friends, and everything between us just clicked. For the longest time, I thought we were that perfect couple everyone admired. We had a smooth routine, shared hobbies, and I honestly believed I could trust her with my life. But over the past few months, things have been off. It started subtle, like how she began keeping her phone closer, always on silent, or flipped upside down when we'd sit down for dinner. She's been hanging out late after work more than usual, saying it's just a few drinks with coworkers. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, Ashley's always been outgoing, and she's got a lot of friends. But then came the excuses. A lot of them. One night, she was working late and didn't get home until after midnight. When I asked her why she didn't at least text me, she got defensive. "I don't have to check in every minute of my life," she snapped. That reaction was not like her. Ashley's never been the type to get so worked up over a simple question. In my gut, I felt something was wrong, but I kept pushing it down, convincing myself I was overreacting. I didn't want to be that paranoid husband who jumps to conclusions without proof. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away, and every day, the tension between us grew thicker. I'll tell you more soon. Things got worse. After that night, I started paying closer attention. Not in an obvious way. I didn't want to come across as suspicious or controlling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ashley kept talking about this new guy at work, Eric. She'd mention him casually, saying he was a great addition to the team or that he was so funny. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but the way her face lit up when she talked about him, it just didn't sit right with me. Then there were the nights when she came home smelling like she'd been out at a bar, even though she told me she had been working late. I'd ask her about it, and she'd shrug it off. "Oh, we just grabbed a quick drink after the meeting," she'd say. Every time I asked who we included, she'd get vague. Just the usual crowd from work. One evening, I decided to surprise her at work. I brought her favorite coffee and some snacks, thinking it would be a nice gesture. But when I got there, her office was empty. A couple of her coworkers were still there, but when I asked if they had seen her, they told me she had left hours ago. My stomach dropped. I stood there, holding the coffee in my hand, feeling like a complete idiot. I texted her, casually asking when she was planning to come home. She replied almost immediately, saying she was just wrapping things up and would be home soon. I didn't respond. I wanted to see how long she'd take to show up after lying to me. She got home an hour later, wearing that same outfit she always wears when she goes out. Not exactly work attire. When I asked her about it, she didn't even flinch. She just laughed it off, saying she had to change into something more comfortable after her long day. But her laugh felt forced, and there was something cold in her eyes. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind was racing, replaying every weird moment from the past few weeks. The late nights, the lies, the mention of Eric. I wanted to believe I was overthinking, that it was all just a coincidence. But deep down I knew something was wrong, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. More to come. This is where things really took a turn. The following weekend, Ashley told me she was heading out for a girls' night. I didn't think much of it at first, but something felt off. Her friends usually came by to pick her up, but this time, she left on her own. My instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right, but I forced myself to trust her. After all, it was just a night out with friends, right? I couldn't relax, though. Every minute she was gone, I felt this growing tension in my chest. It got to the point where I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I grabbed her laptop from the living room and opened it up. I felt sick just thinking about snooping through her things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see for myself if something was going on. When I opened her email, nothing looked suspicious at first, just work stuff, mostly. But then I noticed a folder in her inbox labeled Personal. I clicked on it, and there it was, a string of messages between her and Eric, the guy from her office. Most of the emails were casual, talking about work or grabbing coffee. But then I found one that made my stomach drop. It was from a week ago, and it simply said, "I can't stop thinking about last night. No explanation. No context. Just that one sentence. And the worst part? Her reply, me, neither. My heart was pounding. I felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under me. All the little signs, the late nights, the defensiveness, the strange behavior, they suddenly clicked into place. I couldn't believe what I was reading, but at the same time, I wasn't even surprised. Deep down, I had known for weeks. But seeing it in writing, that hit differently. I sat there staring at the screen for what felt like hours. I didn't know what to do next. Do I confront her? Do I wait for more evidence? Part of me wanted to blow up her phone right then and demand an explanation. But another part of me was scared to know the full truth. That night, I didn't sleep again. I just kept replaying that email in my head. I can't stop thinking about last night. What did that even mean? Had they been together? And if so, how long had this been going on? The next morning, Ashley came home acting like everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my night was, and went about her morning routine like nothing had changed. But for me, everything had changed. I had proof now, and I wasn't going to let this slide. The confrontation was coming. I just needed to figure out how. That morning, after Ashley got back from her so-called girls' night, I could barely look at her. I felt like I was sitting next to a stranger. She hummed a tune in the kitchen as she made her coffee, acting completely normal while my mind was spinning. I knew I had to confront her, but I wanted to keep my cool. Blowing up at her wouldn't help me get the answers I needed. So I waited until after breakfast. I casually said, "Hey, can we talk for a minute?" She glanced over at me, a bit confused, but didn't seem suspicious. "Sure," she said, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. I didn't want to dive right in, so I started with something simple. "Is everything okay between us?" I asked. "You've been acting a little distant lately." She frowned and tilted her head like she was genuinely confused. "What do you mean, we're fine? Really? Because it feels like something's changed," I pressed, trying to keep my voice calm. She gave a little laugh, like the whole thing was ridiculous. "You're just imagining things. Work has been stressful, that's all." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "What about Eric? You've been spending a lot of time with him lately, haven't you?" The second I mentioned his name, I saw it. The brief flicker of panic in her eyes before she quickly composed herself. "Eric? He's just a coworker. We work on the same projects, so yeah, we hang out sometimes. What's the big deal?" Her casual tone only made me angrier. "I saw the emails, Ashley," I said, locking eyes with her. "The ones where you're talking about last night. Care to explain?" She froze. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face completely blank. Then, as if flipping a switch, she rolled her eyes and scoffed. "You went through my emails? Seriously? That's a huge invasion of privacy." I couldn't believe she was turning this around on me. "You're really going to act like I'm the problem here?" I shot back. "I saw the emails, Ashley. You're hiding something. I deserve to know the truth." She crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair, her face turning cold. "You're being paranoid. There's nothing going on with Eric." I shook my head, feeling my frustration rising. "Don't lie to me. I know something's happening between you two. Just tell me the truth." She stood up abruptly, her voice sharp. "I'm not doing this right now. You're acting crazy, and I'm not going to sit here and be interrogated." And with that, she stormed out of the room, leaving me sitting there stunned. I thought she'd at least try to deny it more convincingly or explain herself. But instead, she shut down the conversation entirely. Now, I was left with more questions than answers. She hadn't admitted anything, but her reaction said it all. I knew I couldn't let this go, but I also knew I needed more proof before I confronted her again. Things were about to get messy. After Ashley stormed out of the room, I sat there in silence for a while, replaying the conversation in my head. She hadn't confessed, but her reaction was as good as one. I needed more than just an email to confront her properly next time. Something concrete that she couldn't deny. I decided to get smart about this. If she was lying, I needed to catch her in the act. But I didn't want to go overboard with it. No private investigator or anything like that. I was going to handle this myself. That week, I installed a tracking app on her phone. I hated doing it, but I convinced myself it was necessary. I just needed to know where she was really going during all those late work nights and girls' nights out. The app would give me her exact location, and I'd be able to see if she was meeting up with Eric or anyone else. The first few days, nothing major happened. She went to work, came home, and stayed at the gym a little longer than usual, but nothing that screamed affair. I started to second-guess myself, wondering if I had jumped to conclusions. Maybe the email was just flirtatious banter that went too far. Maybe I really was overreacting. But then came Friday night. Ashley told me she was meeting up with her friends again for another girls' night. I casually asked which friends, and she gave me the usual vague answers. Oh, the same group. She kissed me goodbye and left around 8 p.m., dressed up like she always did for these nights out. As soon as she walked out the door, I pulled up the tracking app on my phone. For the first hour, she was at a bar downtown, so I relaxed a bit, thinking maybe I was wrong. But then just before 10 p.m., the location changed. The app showed she had left the bar and was heading across town to a neighborhood I didn't recognize. I zoomed in on the map and felt my stomach drop. She wasn't at another bar or restaurant. She was at someone's house. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove straight there. The whole time, my heart was racing, my mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there, but I couldn't just sit at home and wait. When I pulled up, I parked a few houses down, not wanting her to see me. I sat there, staring at the house, trying to gather the courage to go knock on the door. Through the window, I could see the silhouette of people inside, Ashley and some guy. I couldn't make out who he was, but I didn't need to. I knew. They were standing close, too close. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not like this. I needed a plan, and barging in unannounced wasn't it. So I sat there watching, feeling sick to my stomach, until finally, around midnight, she left the house. I tailed her home, but didn't say a word when she walked in the door, acting as if nothing was wrong. She had no idea I knew, but now I had all the proof I needed. The next step was going to be the hardest. The next morning, I woke up before Ashley. I had barely slept, replaying the events of the night before over and over. Watching her leave that house, seeing her with him, it was like something inside me snapped. There was no going back now. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She came downstairs around 9 a.m., smiling like nothing had happened. "Morning, babe," she said casually, grabbing a cup of coffee. I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Where were you last night, Ashley?" Her smile faltered for just a second before she quickly recovered. "I told you I was out with the girls." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger rise up. "No, you weren't. I know where you were." Her face turned pale, and she set down her coffee. "What are you talking about?" "I followed you, Ashley. I know you weren't with your friends. You were at some guy's house." My voice was steady, but inside, I was falling apart. She stared at me for a moment, her eyes wide. For the first time, she didn't have a quick, snappy comeback. There was no denying it now, and she knew it. Finally, she sighed and sat down at the kitchen table. "Okay," she said quietly. "It's not what you think." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Not what I think." "Then explain it to me, because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think." She looked down at her hands, avoiding eye contact. It's been hard lately, We've been growing apart. And Eric, he's just been there for me. He listens." I clenched my fists under the table, trying to stay calm. "So you've been lying to me, sneaking around and going to his house for emotional support? Is that what you're saying?" Her silence spoke volumes. I leaned back, running a hand through my hair. "How long, Ashley? How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then finally muttered, "A couple of months." Months. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the weight of it all crashing down on me, the lies, the sneaking around, the emotional distance I had felt but ignored. This wasn't just a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a full-blown affair. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I can't do this anymore. I'm done. Her head shot up, panic flashing in her eyes. Wait, what do you mean, done? You're just going to walk away? I laughed bitterly. What did you expect? That I'd just sit here and accept this? That we could go back to how things were? She started to cry, her voice trembling. I don't want to lose you. I made a mistake, okay? I'll stop seeing him. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. But it was too late. Something had broken inside me, something I wasn't sure could ever be fixed. I looked at her, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. You already lost me, Ashley. The second you decided to cheat, you lost me. She didn't say anything after that. She just sat there, staring down at the table, as if the weight of her actions was finally sinking in. I walked out of the house that day, not sure where I was headed, but knowing one thing for sure, I couldn't stay. I drove around for hours after I left the house. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get away from everything, from the lies, the betrayal, the life I thought I had. My mind was racing, but the more I drove, the clearer things became. I thought about calling a friend, but I wasn't ready to talk about it. How do you even explain something like this? Hey, man, guess what? My wife's been cheating on me for months, and I've been clueless. No, I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. So, I kept driving, trying to figure out what my next move was. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a motel. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was quiet, and that's what I needed. I checked in, threw my bag down, and collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. That's when it hit me. Everything I thought we had was gone. The trust, the love, the future we had planned. I had always thought that if something like this happened, I'd handle it better. I thought I'd be the type to just pack up, leave, and never look back. But sitting there in that dingy motel room, I realized it wasn't that simple. We had 8 years together. 8 years of shared memories, of plans, of love. And now, what? It was all over because of some guy she met at work. I kept asking myself why she did it, but I knew there wasn't a satisfying answer. It wasn't something I could fix, no matter how much I tried to make sense of it. That night I lay in bed, thinking about what came next. I knew I couldn't just move on like nothing had happened. Ashley's betrayal had shattered something inside me, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. But I also knew that I couldn't go back. I spent the next few days at that motel, avoiding her calls and texts. She sent me a flurry of messages, apologies, excuses, desperate attempts to get me to come home. But I couldn't face her, not yet. I needed space to figure out what I was going to do. On the third day, she left a voicemail, her voice shaking. Please come home. We can talk about this. I know I messed up, but I want to fix it. We can still save this, I swear. For the first time in days, I actually considered it. Part of me wanted to go back, to try and rebuild what we had. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that even if we tried to fix things, I'd never be able to trust her again. Every time she went out, every time she smiled at her phone, I'd be wondering if she was lying again. And that's no way to live. So I made my decision. I wasn't going back. Not to her, not to the life we had. It was over. The next step? Divorce. It was time to take the first real step toward moving on. After those days of sitting in that motel room, I knew what I had to do. Divorce was the only option. There was no way I could ever trust Ashley again, no matter how many apologies she threw at me. That trust was broken, and once it's gone, it's almost impossible to rebuild. I made an appointment with a divorce attorney. Sitting in that office felt surreal. Just a few weeks ago, I never would have imagined I'd be sitting there, talking about dividing assets and separating lives. But here I was, outlining the end of our marriage. The lawyer, a woman named Rachel, was calm and professional. She'd probably seen this story 1,000 times before, but for me it was a first. I told her everything. How I found out about the affair, how Ashley had been lying to me for months. Rachel listened quietly, nodding as I talked, and then laid out my options. We can file on the grounds of adultery, she explained. Since you have proof, it'll likely speed up the process, and you'll have a stronger case for keeping more of your assets. I hadn't even thought about the financial side of things. We had a house, cars, and savings. Everything was tied together. And then there was the question of what Ashley would try to fight for. It was hard to think of the woman I'd spent 8 years with as someone I'd now be fighting against in court. What about her? I asked. What can she take? Rachel leaned back in her chair. It depends. If we go the route of a contested divorce, she could try to claim half of everything. But since you have proof of her affair, we have leverage. It's likely she'll settle to avoid things getting ugly. Ugly. The whole situation was already ugly. When I left the lawyer's office, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that I was taking action, but also a deep sadness that this was where my life had ended up. Divorce. It sounded so final, like a door being slammed shut. That evening, I went back to the motel and drafted a message to Ashley. I couldn't do it face to face. Not yet. I told her I had met with a lawyer, that I was filing for divorce, and that it was over. I kept it short, simple, and to the point. I didn't need to rehash everything or drag it out. I hesitated before hitting send, staring at the words on the screen. Part of me still couldn't believe this was real. But I knew it had to be done. There was no saving this marriage, no matter how hard I might want to believe otherwise. When I finally sent the message, I felt like I had let go of a huge weight. It hurt, but at the same time it was freeing. There was no turning back now. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Ashley calling me. I ignored it. She called again and again. Each time, I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to deal with her. Not now. Then, the text started coming in. Please, let's talk. We can work through this. I'll do anything to fix it. But I was done. I wasn't going to let her reel me back in. We were beyond repair. Next up, finding a place to stay because I wasn't going back to the house. After sending that text, I knew I couldn't stay in the motel forever. I needed to figure out my next steps, where to live, what to do with the house, and how to move on from the life Ashley and I had built together. Going back to the house wasn't an option. Every room would remind me of the betrayal, and I wasn't ready to face her in person. So, I started looking for a short-term rental. I needed a place that was mine, somewhere I could clear my head and plan my next move. I found a small apartment across town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was enough. The lease was month to month, which gave me the flexibility I needed while I figured things out. I packed up a few essentials from the motel and headed over to the new place. Walking into that empty apartment was a strange feeling. On the one hand, it was a clean slate, a new beginning. But on the other, it felt so final. This wasn't the life I had envisioned. I had thought Ashley and I would grow old together in our house, maybe have kids someday, and now I was sitting in a temporary apartment starting over. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the house. I didn't want to leave everything behind, but I also couldn't live there with Ashley anymore. The memories were too fresh, too painful. So, I called Rachel, my lawyer, the next day to talk about the house. Can I force her to move out? I asked, hoping for some way to keep the house without having to live under the same roof as Ashley. It's tricky, Rachel replied. Unless you have a legal separation agreement in place that outlines who gets to stay in the house, it's usually best to work out an arrangement between the two of you. But if she's uncooperative, we can push for it in court. The thought of fighting over the house in court made me sick. I didn't want to drag this out more than necessary, but I also didn't want to just hand it over to her. Let's see if we can negotiate something, I said, trying to stay practical. I don't want to make this uglier than it has to be. Later that day, I texted Ashley. I kept it civil, explaining that I had moved out and suggesting that we figure out a plan for the house. She didn't respond for hours, but when she did, her tone was different. It was more desperate. Please, let's talk, her message read. I'm willing to move out if that's what you want. We can work something out, I promise. I wasn't sure if she meant it or if this was another attempt to reel me back in, but I agreed to meet with her to discuss the logistics. It was time to face her, whether I wanted to or not. The next morning, I drove back to the house for the first time since I'd left. My stomach twisted as I pulled into the driveway. There it was, the home we had shared, the place where everything fell apart. I took a deep breath and walked up to the door, unsure of what to expect when I saw her again. Standing outside the house felt surreal, like I was about to step into a life I no longer belonged to. The place looked the same, but everything about it felt different, like it was someone else's home, not mine anymore. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Ashley opened it, her eyes red and puffy, like she hadn't slept all night. "Hey," she said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. I could see the tension in her body, the weight of everything that had happened between us hanging in the air. I didn't waste time. I wasn't there to comfort her or talk about feelings. "We need to talk about the house," I said, my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. She nodded and led me into the living room. The same living room where we had spent so many evenings together, watching TV, laughing, just being normal. It felt distant now, like those moments belonged to someone else's life. We sat down, the silence between us thick, with everything unsaid. Ashley spoke first. "I know I messed up," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know what I was thinking. I don't even know how it got this far." I didn't respond. I had heard enough of her excuses over the last few days. I wasn't there to rehash the details of her affair. I was there to move forward. "I don't care about that anymore," I finally said. "I'm not here to talk about what happened. I just need to know how we're going to handle the house." She blinked, taken aback by my bluntness. I could tell she wanted to talk about us, about the relationship. But I wasn't going to give her that. "Okay," she said, her voice shaky. "If you want to keep the house, I'll move out." I nodded, relieved that we wouldn't have to fight over it. "You can take whatever you want from the house, but I need you to be gone by the end of the week," I said, trying to sound firm without being cruel. Tears welled up in her eyes. "That's it? You're really done?" I met her gaze, feeling a strange mix of anger and sadness. "Yeah, I'm done, Ashley. Whatever this was, it's over. I've given everything I had to this marriage, and you threw it away." She wiped her eyes and nodded, but didn't say anything more. There was nothing left to say. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, the reality of the situation sinking in for both of us. After a while, I stood up. "I'll be by this weekend to check if you've gotten your stuff," I said. "And then we can talk to the lawyer about finalizing everything." Ashley didn't try to stop me. She just nodded again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." As I walked out of the house and closed the door behind me, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the kind of satisfying closure where everything feels resolved, but more like a final acceptance. I had faced Ashley, made my decision, and now it was time to move on. I drove back to my apartment, knowing that this chapter of my life was finally closing. The weekend came faster than I expected. I spent the days leading up to it trying to distract myself, working longer hours, going for runs, anything to avoid thinking too much about the mess my life had become. But I knew I'd have to go back to the house to see if Ashley had moved out, and the thought of it weighed on me. When Saturday morning arrived, I got into my car and headed back to the house. I wasn't sure what I would find when I got there, whether she would have actually packed up her things, or if this would turn into a messy situation. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw her car was gone, which was a good sign. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. I walked through the living room, kitchen, and upstairs bedroom. Most of her stuff was gone, her clothes, her makeup, the small things she'd always left lying around. The house felt emptier, colder, without her presence. Part of me felt relieved, but another part of me couldn't ignore the sadness. It wasn't supposed to end like this. We were supposed to have a life together, but now I was standing in what used to be our home alone. I knew I had made the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. As I walked through the empty rooms, memories came flooding back. I could picture us laughing in the kitchen, watching movies on the couch, decorating the house for Christmas. It hurt, realizing that those moments were gone for good. But I knew there was no fixing this. No going back. After checking that everything was in order, I sat down at the dining table. The same table where we'd had countless dinners, talked about our days, and dreamed about the future. I felt the weight of the loneliness settle in, but I also felt a strange sense of freedom. It was like a heavy burden had been lifted, even if it left an empty space behind. I picked up my phone and texted Rachel, my lawyer. Ashley's moved out. Let's move forward with the paperwork. It was time to officially close this chapter. Later that day, I started boxing up what was left of her things. There wasn't much, just a few personal items she hadn't taken with her. I wasn't angry as I packed them up. I didn't feel like throwing them out or destroying them. Instead, I felt done. Done with the anger, the sadness, the betrayal. I was ready to start fresh, even if I wasn't entirely sure how to do that yet. I took a deep breath as I finished packing. This was the last of it. I was officially on my own now, and that was okay. It was time to rebuild, to figure out who I was without Ashley. As I loaded the boxes into my car to drop off at her friend's house, I thought about what came next. Life wasn't going to look the way I had planned, but that didn't mean it couldn't be good again. It was just going to take some time, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had all the time in the world to figure it out. After I dropped off the last of Ashley's things at her friend's house, I drove back to my apartment, feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. The finality of it all was settling in, but I also realized that this was the start of something new. I didn't know what my life would look like from here, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control of my future again. That night, I sat in my empty apartment and started making a list of things I needed to do. It felt like a way to keep myself grounded, to focus on the practical instead of getting lost in my thoughts. I wrote down simple things: find a new routine, get back to the gym, reconnect with old friends, maybe even look into therapy. I knew I wasn't going to figure everything out overnight, but I needed to take small steps. The next few weeks were filled with adjustments. I started working out again, something I had neglected during the chaos of the affair and the separation. It felt good to focus on my health, to release some of the pent-up anger and sadness I had been carrying. I also reached out to a few friends I hadn't seen in a while, guys who had been around before Ashley and I got serious, but who I had drifted away from over the years. It was comforting to reconnect, to talk about normal things that had nothing to do with the mess my life had become. One of my friends, Mike, invited me to a small get-together at his place. I hadn't been to any social events since the split, but I figured it was time to try. I couldn't spend every night alone in my apartment, drowning in my thoughts. When I got there, it felt strange at first, being around people who didn't know about what had happened with Ashley. But as the night went on, I found myself laughing, talking, and even forgetting about the divorce for a while. Mike pulled me aside at one point and asked how I was doing. He knew something was up, but didn't push for details. "If you ever need to talk, man, you know I'm here," he said. I appreciated that. It wasn't easy for me to talk about what had happened, but knowing I had people who would listen made the process a little less daunting. As the weeks passed, I started to realize that life was slowly getting back to normal, or at least a new version of normal. I was adjusting to the quiet of my apartment, the freedom of making my own choices without worrying about anyone else. But there were still moments when the loneliness hit hard, like when I came home to an empty place after a long day at work, or when I saw couples out together, reminding me of what I had lost. One night, as I lay in bed, I found myself scrolling through old pictures on my phone, photos of Ashley and me from happier times. I don't know why I did it, but part of me was still trying to understand how we got here. How did we go from being in love to being strangers? As I scrolled, I realized that it wasn't about understanding anymore. It was about accepting that some things just fall apart, no matter how much you want them to stay together. That realization was bittersweet, but it also brought a sense of closure. Ashley and I had our time, and it was over. Now it was about rebuilding, finding out who I was without her, and creating a life that was mine again. Next up, I had to figure out how to really move on, emotionally and mentally. I was getting there, but I knew there was still a long road ahead. As the days turned into weeks, I settled into my new routine. Physically, I was doing better, working out, reconnecting with friends, and trying to stay busy. But emotionally, that was a whole different story. No matter how much I distracted myself, the weight of everything that had happened still lingered. Nights were the hardest. During the day, I could keep moving, keep doing things to take my mind off Ashley and the divorce. But at night, when everything was quiet, my mind would go into overdrive. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the past few months, wondering if I had missed the signs sooner or if there was something I could have done to stop it. I was haunted by questions I couldn't answer. What if I had paid more attention? What if I had confronted her earlier? Would things be different now if I had fought harder? Part of me knew it wasn't my fault. Ashley had made her choices. But another part of me couldn't help but feel like I had failed somehow. That's when the guilt started creeping in, even though logically, I knew I didn't deserve it. I couldn't handle it on my own anymore. I needed help sorting through everything I was feeling. That's when I remembered something my lawyer, Rachel, had said during our first meeting. Divorce can be emotionally draining, she had told me. It might be worth talking to someone just to help you process everything. So, I decided to give therapy a shot. I found a therapist, Dr. Harris, who came highly recommended by one of my friends. It felt strange at first, walking into that office and sitting on a couch, spilling my heart out to a stranger. But after a few sessions, I realized it was exactly what I needed. Dr. Harris didn't judge me. He just listened, helping me unpack the emotional mess I had been carrying. In one of our sessions, I finally admitted the thing that had been eating at me the most. I feel like I wasn't enough. Like, if I had been better as a husband, better at communicating, maybe she wouldn't have cheated. Dr. Harris looked at me for a moment before speaking. It's normal to feel that way. But the reality is, her actions were her choice. You're responsible for your own behavior, but not for someone else's decisions. You can't control that. Hearing those words gave me a bit of clarity. I had been carrying around this weight, thinking that maybe I could have prevented what happened. But in reality, Ashley had chosen to betray me, and that was on her, not me. It was a tough pill to swallow, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I started to let go of the guilt I had been holding on to. Over the next few sessions, Dr. Harris helped me work through the anger, the sadness, and the sense of betrayal. He encouraged me to focus on what I could control, my own healing, my own future. It wasn't easy, but it was a step in the right direction. I also started journaling, writing down my thoughts and feelings whenever they became too much to handle. It was a way to get everything out of my head and onto paper, where I could look at it from a different perspective. Sometimes, the words didn't make sense, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I was giving myself the space to feel everything, without pushing it down or pretending it wasn't there. Through therapy and journaling, I began to realize that healing wasn't going to be a straight line. Some days I felt like I was making progress, like I could finally breathe again. Other days, I'd be hit with a wave of sadness or anger, and it would feel like I was back at square one. But that was okay. Healing wasn't about getting over it. It was about learning to live with it, finding a way to move forward without letting the past define me. I was getting there little by little, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I was on the path to something better, something that belonged to me. Next up, figuring out how to trust again, in a world where trust had been shattered. As I started to heal, I realized something that scared me. I didn't know if I could ever trust someone again. The betrayal I'd experienced with Ashley had left deep scars, and even though I was making progress, I couldn't shake the fear that if I let someone new into my life, they'd hurt me the same way. I knew I wasn't ready to date yet, but I started thinking about what it would be like when I was. The idea of opening up to someone again, being vulnerable, terrified me. How could I trust anyone after what Ashley had done? How could I believe that someone wouldn't just lie to my face the way she had? In one of my therapy sessions, I brought this up to Dr. Harris. I'm scared that I'll never be able to trust again, I admitted. What if I'm always looking for signs that someone's cheating? What if I can't let my guard down? He nodded thoughtfully. That's a valid fear, especially after what you've been through. But trust isn't something that's rebuilt overnight. It takes time, and it's okay to feel cautious. The important thing is not to let fear control your future. What if I never get past it? I asked. Trust isn't just about the other person, he said. It's about trusting yourself too. Trusting that you'll recognize the warning signs, that you'll make the right choices for yourself. It's about rebuilding your own confidence so you don't feel powerless in the relationship. His words hit me hard. I had been so focused on whether I could trust someone else that I hadn't considered the fact that part of this journey was about learning to trust myself again. Ashley's betrayal had shattered my confidence, not just in relationships, but in my own judgment. I had ignored the signs for months, convincing myself everything was fine, and that made me doubt my own instincts. Dr. Harris encouraged me to take small steps, to trust my gut again in everyday situations. He reminded me that learning to trust wasn't about rushing into something new, but about rebuilding my own sense of self. If I could trust myself, I could slowly learn to trust others again. I started small, listening to my intuition in situations that had nothing to do with relationships. Whether it was deciding what to do at work or how to spend my weekends, I began to check in with myself more. Instead of second-guessing everything, I tried to trust my own decisions. It was a subtle shift, but it made a difference. The more I trusted myself in these little moments, the more confident I became. As the weeks went by, I began to feel less afraid of the idea of dating again. I wasn't rushing into anything, but I was no longer convinced that I'd never be able to trust anyone. The fear was still there, but it wasn't controlling me the way it had before. One night, I went out for drinks with Mike and a few friends. It was the first time in a long time that I felt relaxed, like I wasn't carrying the weight of everything that had happened. During the night, one of Mike's friends introduced me to someone new, a woman named Sarah. We talked for a while, and it felt normal. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people having a conversation. At the end of the night, Sarah asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the old fear creeping in. But then I remembered what Dr. Harris had said about trusting myself. So, I smiled and said yes. I wasn't ready to jump into anything serious, but I was ready to take that small step, to see what it felt like to open up just a little. That coffee date with Sarah wasn't life-changing, but it was important. It reminded me that I could still connect with people, still find moments of joy, even after everything I'd been through. We didn't turn into anything serious, just a couple of casual meetups here and there, but that wasn't the point. The point was that I had taken a step toward reclaiming my life. In the months that followed, I focused on building a future that was truly mine. I kept going to therapy, kept journaling, and kept learning how to trust myself. It was a slow process, but every small victory felt huge. Whether it was feeling confident about a decision at work or simply enjoying a weekend without the weight of the past dragging me down. I also started thinking about what I really wanted from life. For so long, my plans had been tied to Ashley, our home, our future, our routines. But now it was just me. I had a blank slate, and while that was scary, it was also exciting. I made a list of things I had always wanted to do, but never found the time for. Traveling was at the top of that list. Ashley and I had always talked about traveling more, but we'd never gotten around to it. So, I booked a solo trip to Colorado to hike the Rockies, something I had always dreamed about but never thought I'd do on my own. That trip changed everything. Standing at the top of a mountain, with nothing but miles of wilderness around me, I felt more alive than I had in years. It was like I could finally breathe again. The weight of the past didn't feel as heavy up there. I wasn't the guy whose wife cheated. I was just me, someone who had survived, someone who was stronger than I ever realized. When I came back from that trip, I felt different, lighter, like I was finally ready to fully let go of the life I had with Ashley and embrace whatever came next. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, I came across our wedding album. I hadn't looked at it since the split, and for a moment I felt a pang of sadness. But then I realized something. Those memories didn't hurt as much as they used to. They were just that, memories. They didn't define who I was now. I flipped through the album one last time before closing it for good. It was time to stop looking back. I also started spending more time with friends, old and new. Mike and I reconnected in a way we hadn't in years, and it felt good to have someone in my corner who wasn't judging me or expecting me to have all the answers. I even made a few new friends through hiking and joined a local outdoors group. It was a whole new chapter, and for the first time I was excited about it. One night, after a long day at work, I sat on my balcony with a beer, looking out at the city lights. I thought about how far I'd come. From that moment of discovering Ashley's betrayal to now, there had been so much pain, so many sleepless nights, and so much self-doubt. But I had made it through, and as I sat there, I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I was building something new, something that was all mine. So, what advice would I give to someone going through what I did? It's simple, but it took me a long time to figure it out. Trust yourself. Healing doesn't happen overnight, and there's no perfect roadmap for getting through betrayal. But if you trust yourself, really trust yourself, you'll find your way. One small step at a time. Because in the end, life isn't about what you've lost. It's about what you build after. And for the first time, I'm ready to build something incredible.